Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this. Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
He's not my hero.
How heroic he comes
Idiot. If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez.
Oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
Welcome to this episode of the Sensible Socialist Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Gustafson, and in this episode, I am going to play the audio of a lecture that I gave to a high school class, basically a sort of Socialism 101. I gotta give the background as to why I am giving this particular lecture as I give the lecture, but the long and short of it is I was asked when I was in high school to give a lecture about socialism because I thought it was important that we have at least one day to talk about alternative economic systems. And my teacher has asked me to come back every year since graduating in 2004 and to give the speech once or twice a year. So it's evolved, and I've been able to see a huge change in the receptivity of people to these ideas, to socialist ideas, over these last 16 years that I've been doing the lecture. And so you hear some discussion in this lecture, but for the most part, people are relatively open to the ideas and want to hear more about them. So you'll see that I give a different way of presenting socialism to people that might not have heard about it, or what they've heard is from Bernie Sanders, something like that. So without further ado, here's the lecture that I gave in February of 2020 to a high school class about socialism. All right, so my name is Kevin Gustafson, and I am a graduate of Owatonna Senior High School. I graduated in 2004, so to hear it's the class of 2020 is pretty crazy. It seems like forever ago that I was in the very chairs and desks that you guys are probably still sitting in. So, just a little bit about me. I am a lawyer. I work at a legal tech company, so I work in legal software. I went to American University for law school out here in Washington, D.C. I went to undergraduate and graduate school at Mankato, at MSU in Mankato, and I went to high school in Owatonna. I studied philosophy and political science in undergrad, and I graduated in 2008 when the entire economy collapsed, and so it was very difficult for me to find a job with, of course, a philosophy degree. So I decided to go back to grad school and get a master's of public administration so I could get a job in the government bureaucracy and have a cushy job and not have to work very hard and have a pension and all that good stuff. And eventually realized that I basically wasn't going to get much of an opportunity there. Eventually moved on to Florida, got a job at a law firm working as a paralegal, and that ultimately led me to go to law school, which I studied international human rights and humanitarian law. So that's like the laws during wartime and, human rights law, which are very important, but unfortunately our country doesn't really believe in too much. But I came out here to go to law school in Washington, D.C. Now I live in Washington, D.C., and I work at a company called Fastcase, which is a legal research company helping people find the cases they need and doing all that kind of stuff. So that's a little bit of a background about me. And so we're here today to talk a bit about socialism. So just sort of by a raise of hands, Anybody paying attention to the Iowa caucus and the Democratic election that just happened this week? Anybody paying attention? Hands up. Few people. Okay. You guys know that Bernie Sanders won the Iowa primary, right? Or Iowa caucus, I guess. So what I am here to talk about is socialism, which is, I think, a question that a lot of people are wanting to talk about and wanting to learn more about. And some people are very fearful about it. Some people are very hopeful about it. The polling seems to suggest that people your age are much more cool with socialism than people even my age, and certainly people Walter's age. So hopefully this is not going to be, sort of crazy or left, out of left field kind of stuff for you to hear. But it's also helpful to have a back and forth. So if there's at any point anybody's got any questions or anything like that, just sort of spout up. You'll have to talk pretty loud because I think it's going to be a little hard to hear, but as long as you can kind of yell your question, a conversation is usually much more interesting than just listening to me blather on a screen for however long. So just keep that in mind as we kind of go forward. But to just give you a little bit of background about sort of where I come from on this socialism stuff, I basically became a socialist sitting in the very chairs that you're sitting in. I was in high school at OHS. And we had to do a debate in our English class, and it was like the Oxford-style debate. So everybody took a vote. You had a motion, and everybody took a vote, and then you do the debate, and then you do the vote on the same motion. And so I was kind of a cocky little kid, and I wanted to argue something I knew would never work. So I was, a good student, and I'd learned in my history and economics classes that something that doesn't work is communism. So I decided that I was going to argue that America should adopt a communist form of government. And I didn't really know anything about communism because I had, gone to school in the United States, and I had been taught by people who had basically taught me that the Soviet Union was worse than Nazi Germany, that, Joseph Stalin was worse than Hitler, that America and the Soviet Union were, on opposite sides. And of course, America is the shining city on the hill, and it's the best country in the world, and it's the greatest thing that's since sliced bread. And so, of course, it was better than the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union didn't work. We won the Cold War. So how am I going to win this argument? So what I did is I actually went back and read the Communist Manifesto, and I read a few other things that are pretty basic sort of materials on what you'd learn when you learn about what's ultimately called Marxism. And I realized that what I had been taught was total bullshit. And I'm just going to be honest with you guys. I'm not going to mince words with you guys. You're old enough. It was bullshit. What I had been taught, and what I think a lot of times what you guys are being taught, is essentially propaganda. And I realized in studying for this debate that actually the ideas of socialism and communism are pretty amazing, and that we should really be into these ideas. And so I started learning more and more about them. And became pretty committed that these are ideas that could really make humanity and the world a much better place. So I got really angry when I was in the economics class that Walters was teaching, and we didn't at all talk about alternative economic systems. That our economics class was not really economics; it was how capitalism works. And there's understandable reasons for that, but I thought we should at least have one day where you could talk about alternative economic systems like socialism or maybe Islamic banking or something like that. And so Walter's in I don't know if it's infinite wisdom or what it is, but decided that he would let me give a lecture. So I was, 18, giving a lecture to my own fellow students about ideas that they hadn't heard of, and that had ostracized me and many other people, and had ultimately gotten people, killed, captured, deported, and things like that. And so, but I gave the speech, and it went decent. And so, since 2004 up until now, so for the last 16 years, I've been coming back and giving essentially a lecture that's just a sort of introduction to socialism. So in my time, I've joined a lot of different socialist parties. I was a member of the Communist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, Socialist Alternative. I was in the Youth for Socialist Action. I've been part of organizing May Day associations and doing different actions and things like that for a lot of different things, whether that be defending people against homelessness, fighting anti-war protests, even Black Lives Matter and a number of different things that are sort of what you do when you're involved in the socialist left. Recently, I've pulled back a little bit from that on-the-ground organizing to start a podcast. So I know that podcasts are a big thing that people like to listen to, and so if you're interested in learning more, you guys can check out The Sensible Socialist. It's just sensiblesocialist.com. You can find it on Stitcher, iTunes, Spotify, all that kind of stuff. But I've got quickly approaching 50 episodes where we talk about different topics and give an idea about the background of these things, and obviously in much more detail than I'll be able to give in the time that I have left. So if you're interested in these ideas, check out the Sensible Socialist. There's also other really good podcasts, including Chapo Trap House, the Revolutionary Left Radio. There's a lot of good podcasts that if you're interested in this stuff, there is a bottomless well of information that you can always learn more about. So that is a bit of a background just about me and how I got into this, and maybe I guess some credentials in the fact that I have been into this for quite a while and have been thinking about it for a long time and feel like I can at least give a bit of a background about what socialism is. So with that, I want to ask you guys, just to frame our talk or our discussion here. What do you guys know about socialism? If I asked you, what is socialism? Somebody give me an answer.
I'm no brain. Isn't it more like dispersed wealth instead of like centralized on like a very small portion of people?
Okay, yeah. So more equal distribution of wealth. Okay. Anything else?
Christian, you had something, right?
I thought it was more like everyone chipping in to put in, like everyone has a fund in the middle that they all chip into, and they do things with that money for everyone globally.
Okay, so yeah, the participation by everybody into some kind of general wealth fund, and the general wealth fund would then fund programs that would take care of people. Okay, anything else?
What's
that?
Isn't the sorry, I'm trying to think the right word on.
I didn't catch the last of it. You gotta yell really loud.
A bunch of lazy people who are mooching off the government.
Sure. There's a lot if you're talking about a big thing that Ronald Reagan used to talk about were welfare queens, which is somebody who just had kids in order to suck more money out of welfare, and you got things like food stamps and unemployment and those kinds of things that are usually seen as socialist kind of projects. Anything else? Anything else negative? Anybody heard anybody not like socialism?
I can't think of the right word, but is it the abomination of private property?
Abolishment.
Yes.
Abolishment. You're close enough.
You're right.
Yeah, there is a discussion about you'll hear some socialists call for the abolition of private property. That has a pretty specific definition when we're talking about the Marxist idea of private property. But yeah, that's a component of it, the abolition of private property, which I think for some people it's like, holy shit, what are you talking about? Private property? You want me to get rid of all my stuff? And it's a pretty specific definition, so we can talk about that. All right. Anything else? Okay. So
if we were to do it, would a socialist economy work today?
How would it work? Is that what you're asking?
Yes. If it would it work? Would it work?
Would it work? Okay. So to answer that question, we gotta kind of define what it is that we're talking about, or what we mean when we mean socialism. And this is a hard thing to sometimes answer because there's about as many definitions of socialism as there are socialists. And so we have to be sort of pretty distinct in what we mean so that we can know what we are arguing for and how you would argue against it. So for a lot of people, I think that what socialism means is a kind of social safety net. That what socialism means is that we're going to do kind of what Bernie Sanders is talking about. We're going to have a single payer Medicare for all system so that everybody's got access to health care. We're going to make colleges and universities tuition free, basically paid for the same way your high school education is paid for. We're going to, eliminate college debt. We're going to expand Social Security. We're going to do things that are going to make the situation basically a little bit easier for everybody. Now, everybody's going to have to chip in more. There will be an increase in taxes, but at the end of the day, you're going to get a lot of benefits. It's essentially the social contract, the contract that's been made in Europe, where in France, in Sweden, and even in Britain, the government takes care of your healthcare. The government funds your higher education, and that people generally have a higher standard of living. They have a higher happiness index. There are a lot of reasons why there are people who want to adopt these kind of ideas in order to make basically the situation that much better. That is one sort of definition of socialism, but it's not one that really ties back to Marx or ties back to some of the thinkers about what the original sort of idea behind socialism really was. So to kind of get an understanding of that, socialism is basically the antithesis of capitalism. So to understand what a socialist is arguing for, you have to sort of understand what they're arguing against, because fundamentally socialism is a contradiction of capitalism. It's saying that there's something wrong with capitalism. There's something that we have to fix, and that fix is going to be called socialism. So one thing that all socialists share, there isn't a lot of things that all socialists share, but one thing they all share is that they have critiques of capitalism. Okay? So if I were to ask you guys anything, do you guys see anything wrong with the system of capitalism? And maybe we should even start with, how would you define capitalism? So somebody give me a definition of capitalism and maybe something wrong with it. Anybody?
It's more of like an open market sort of thing. So like it benefits a lot of enterprise and private business. So in the end, capitalism really only like benefits a small margin of the population of the country.
Good. So capitalism is a system where private individuals own businesses and employ other people so that to create some kind of commodity or provide some kind of service in order to generate wealth for the person who owns the business. And they do so in a competitive free market. Right? That's a basic definition of capitalism. The most important pieces of that definition, just to kind of say it again, is that you have private individuals who own businesses and based on their ownership, employ other people to work at that business so that it generates, to engage in some kind of enterprise, to generate a profit that will then go back into the business owner's hand. A consequence of that is that the owner tends to be able to accumulate more and more of that wealth. So the people that are being employed by that person are paid a fixed amount. It's called a wage, right? That's what you all, like, how many of you guys have jobs? Raise your hand. Right? How many of you guys own businesses? Okay, that'll be good. That's important later on. But so you have private individuals who own businesses, employing people, and they pay those people a wage. They produce a service or commodity that they charge at the market more than the cost that it took to produce, more than they paid the people to make the product and how much the raw materials cost. And that generates a profit. That profit then comes back to the owner, who then accumulates that profit. So one of the consequences of a system like that is that you do have entrepreneurial spirit of people who are wanting to make a lot of money and who are motivated by that desire to get wealth. And so they will employ people and they will put them to work making things that the society wants or to generate something that people think they might want. And that person is able to make a boatload of money. So there are things that can happen. And capitalism is an incredibly ingenious and effective and widespread and productive system, like no other system ever before. But it also accumulates a huge amount of wealth in smaller and smaller hands, thereby increasing the general inequality between the people who work at businesses and the people who own businesses. And that's one major problem. And so a big criticism that all socialists will have of capitalism is that it fundamentally rests on a class division. And what we mean by a class division is that there are people with different relationships to production, to how things are done. You have the owner who owns the business and employs people, and you have the workers who work at the business. So there's a fundamental difference between how you relate to the enterprise. You have a person who purchases all of the goods and labor, and you have all the people who input the labor. And then at the end of the process, one person gets all the benefit, the person who owns. So all these people don't see the profit that the business generates. All that they see is the wage. The problem with that is, another problem with that, is that if you're selling things for more than you're paying people to make them, there's a difference, there's a negative difference between how much things cost and how much money people have. And that means that you're going to eventually produce more than people can buy. And when you produce more than people can buy, when you overproduce, it causes a crisis. And so when that crisis happens, the business downturns, it tries to sell everything that it has, it can't pay the employees get laid off, they can't purchase more things, other businesses get affected, and you have a dip in the entire economy. That one of the things that capitalism has, because of this fundamental unequal relationship between the owner and the worker, is that the system goes into crisis every 4 to 7 years. And you guys have probably learned that just about as the business cycle, that, times are good, then you have a crash, and then it bottoms out, and then times are good again. Well, if you had a friend who was as unstable as this system, you would not be friends with that person. Because this person has the worst bipolar disorder that you've ever heard in your life. Right? It's just unstable. It doesn't make any sense. And the destruction that comes at those downturns, and when you're looking at 2008, thousands of people lost their lives. Hundreds of thousands lost their homes. This was a major, major devastating event for tons of people. And a whole generation, my generation, lost a future. It's taken us 10 to 15 years to be where we should have been in 2010. So there are serious costs to this instability. But there are things that are gained by it. And one of the big things that's gained by it is this accumulation of wealth. And wealth allows you to purchase power. So we see in the United States the ability for wealthy people to buy elections and buy people who then make laws in their interests. And so even if you have a democracy in your country, the democracy is bought and sold by the rich. And so this isn't a country by, for, and of the people. It's by, of, and for the rich. And everybody, I think, kind of knows that deep down inside, that this isn't really a true democracy, and it's not even a true republic. It's a government that's for rich people, that makes laws for rich people. And that's the grand irony of the welfare system, is that the welfare system isn't a socialist program, it's a capitalist program. The goal of welfare is to make sure that people are well enough so that they can eventually go to work, which is why you don't stay on welfare forever. And you can't stay on welfare forever because eventually you have to get a job. And so the point of welfare isn't just to hand out money to people because people are nice. It's to make sure that you are able to stay alive enough so that you can get another job. Because the whole point of being a person in the United States economy is to simply be a worker. And all a worker is another commodity, just like a screwdriver or a machine or anything like that. You're not a real human being. You're just a worker. And so there are fundamental problems with capitalism. And socialists all agree that on these sort of fundamental problems. But where we disagree is how we address those problems. And so for a certain number of people who will call themselves, say, democratic socialists, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders, will say that what we need to do is we need to restrain that ability for there to be this massive inequality, and for there to be, that the ups and downs will be less up and down. They'll kind of, be a little bit like this, but it'll be okay. But we're not going to talk about fundamentally readjusting the relationship between the owner and the worker or anything like that. We're just talking about making capitalism a little bit less unstable and a little bit less unequal. But we're not talking about fundamentally getting rid of capitalism or changing the way the economy works. So what a socialist, somebody like me, sees that argument as not an argument for socialism. That's an argument for what I would call, and what a lot of people have called, social democracy, which is what you have in France or in Italy or even in Venezuela. You don't have socialism in Venezuela. You have social democracy in Venezuela. So what do we mean? So what do I mean when I say that that's not socialist, that socialist is something else? What I mean by that is that socialism is readjusting the fundamental relationship between the worker and the owner of a business. Because we see that relationship not only as the cause of crisis and the fundamental reason for the inequality, but also as fundamentally exploitative. That you're being screwed over by your boss because your boss gets all the profit. You work at the business and generate all of the business's profit, and you don't see a dime of it. How many of you guys have seen the movie Office Space? Have you ever seen that? And then we'll get to your question. Okay, if you haven't seen Office Space, just find it on YouTube or something. You watch the movie. It's fantastic because it's basically about this guy who realizes that his job is basically a bunch of bullshit, and he stops caring. And he has this great speech where he says, look, if I work my ass off and my company does a little better, I don't see an extra dime. So what's the motivation for me to work? Well, it's just to work hard enough not to get fired. And that's exactly how many of us feel. I mean, how many of you guys love to go to work? Not many of us. Most of us work because we need money. If you really like to go to work, you're very lucky because most of us do not. And you still probably don't think you're paid well enough because there's money being made and you're not getting it. And that's fundamentally unfair. It's fundamentally exploitative. And so for socialists, there's something fundamentally wrong with the fact that there are business owners and workers. That there is this, what Marx called the bourgeoisie, the owner class, and the proletariat, right? So I don't know if you ever heard anything be called bougie before. God, that's so bougie. What that comes from is the bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie are all the capitalists, the business owners, the people who don't do any work at all, who just invest in the stock market and get their dividend check. Those people, those lazy people who are really taking from other people, are way worse than any welfare queen or anybody getting money from the government because they're taking all of our money because we're the ones as workers who are generating the income. So for a socialist, what they mean by socialism is that workers own the means of production, not business owners, not Bill Gates and not Warren Buffett and Elon Musk and all those other douchebags, but all of us together. In a cooperative way, in dare I say, a democratic way. Because why don't we, if we can run our city democratically, why can't we run our businesses democratically? So yeah, question, and speak loudly.
I actually would like to bring up a point of that you're calling them lazy asses, but there's also a point that you're forgetting to mention that if the company does go bottom up, who takes all the risk? At the worst, the worker's out of a job, but they're not going to be bankrupt and have to pay all these checks because they lost their job or was working for someone who went bankrupt.
Sure. So that's always, that is often an argument, right? Who's actually more investing in more risk. Okay. So if you think about that, a business owner, right? Somebody who takes the risk that a business owner is taking is essentially financial. It's a financial risk. I'm taking a loan from a bank or I'm investing my own money into an enterprise that I want to see some kind of return at. So I'm taking a risk. But the thing is, for two reasons, the risk is actually pretty light. One, the risk that a business owner is taking is to not be a worker. Because at the end of the day, if the business fails, they can always sell their labor. That's what you do when you go to a job. When you get a wage from your boss, you're selling yourself. Now, you're not really a whore, but let's think about that. You're selling your time and labor, and you're getting money for that. Okay? And so that is what all of us can do. All of us can sell our labor. We are all fundamentally workers. So what a business owner does is simply say, I don't want to be a worker anymore. I'm going to take the risk of becoming a worker again if this fails, but I want to try to get out of that working class and I want to get up into the owning class. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the risk that I'm going to lose all of the money that I've either invested or all of the money that I've taken out at a loan and potentially lose that money. But if you lose that money, it's not like you die. You simply become a worker. And we have bankruptcy protections and all sorts of things in the capitalist system that, believe me, you can ask Donald Trump about this. If you fail, you just file for bankruptcy and start over again. It's no big deal. So the risk that a business owner takes is very light. And the rewards that they get because they take this risk, the amount of profit that they're able to get, is unseemly. You have people who have billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars. Even, you're looking at the richest people in the world, the amount of, they cannot even spend the amount of money that they've been stealing from the people that they work at. And look at the places that they work at. These, look at an Amazon employee. You have the richest person in the world, and the people who work at the warehouses that get you your goods have to piss in bottles because they otherwise they won't meet their quotas. And they work for $15 an hour, while this man makes more money than he could spend in hundreds of lifetimes. So the risk that we're talking about is really just a risk to be like everybody else, which isn't much of a risk. And second, there's all kinds of protections against that person where it's not much of a risk anyway. So to justify the benefits that people get because they're taking that kind of risk it's just smoke. It's a lot of propaganda. It's not actually justification for the amount of wealth that's extracted from, the lower class. I mean, if you look at since 2008, since that recession, almost all of the wealth that's been generated since that period of time has gone to the top 1%. There's so much of movement of wealth from the bottom part of the society to the top part of the society where the wealth is already there. They are just using their power to extract more and more and more wealth while we have an environmental crisis. But capitalism doesn't care about the environmental crisis because for a regular business, in business right now, there's a thing called a fiduciary duty. Does anybody know what a fiduciary duty is? It's something you should really learn about, and you should learn about it now because it's important. A fiduciary duty is an obligation, a legal duty that a business owner has to increase their profits. If you're on a board of directors, and that board of directors can make a decision between polluting a river and making less money or making more money and polluting the river, they have to make the decision to make the more money. They have to pollute the river. Or a shareholder can go back and say, you didn't make me the most money I could have made. That's against the law. The law says that we have to make money above all else. So that creates a perverse incentive system that allows for a global climate crisis to continue unabated while oil companies and other companies who benefit off of the cause of this fundamental crisis can continue to make gobs and gobs of money. That is the kind of fundamental problems that we have in the system that a socialist says getting rid of this difference between owners and workers will solve. That if you have an economy that's democratically owned and operated, that won't have this kind of increase in inequality. It won't have the environmental and social consequences that the system does. You won't go to war or kill your neighbor or anything like that because you'll have the means to be able to adjudicate your differences in a fundamentally free and democratic way. But yeah, another question.
I was wondering, where exactly is this law? Do you know it offhand of where I could find where this law says that they have to make money up? Above all, or just like an unspoken rule or a law that's just between other people, not a physical on-paper law.
I didn't follow. Say that again.
Where can I find the fiduciary duty law?
Literally, it's in code books in probably every state. It's in the U.S. code. It's in the the Uniform Commercial Code. Just do a quick Google search for fiduciary duty, and you could find citations in law to that. You talk to any accountant or tax professional. An accountant has a fiduciary duty. Anybody that deals in any kind of financial interaction has a fiduciary duty. It comes from English common law, so it's like a fundamental axiomatic principle of American legal jurisprudence that there is a fiduciary duty, that if you have a financial responsibility to somebody, your duty is to make sure that you protect that financial investment above all else. So a quick Google search for fiduciary duty will find that for sure.
KG, just want to bring up a couple points, and I want to hear what you have to say about it. Number one, since 2008, and you've noticed it, I've noticed it, for example, the young man up front here, Cody, works at Hy-Vee still. What's the key word for Hy-Vee? What do they always say? And they are employee owned, like Hy-Vee in town here, employee owned. That was probably something you're kind of thinking about here. Would you agree? Like a company that's employee owned.
Employee owned is good, but it has to be employee owned and controlled, which is the problem with high V. So high V, if you're a full time employee, you have a stock option in the company. So you have an employee stock option program. But the thing is, if your stock doesn't translate directly into ownership, so that you can help make the decisions for the business, it's better than nothing. It's better than just making a wage. But if there's no control that comes out of it, you still have the same feelings of like alienation. I don't really give a shit about the job. I want the business to do better, but I don't have any ability to make any decisions in terms of that. So you still have that kind of fundamental relationship between who owns the business and who works there. But the weird thing is you're kind of both. And so it's a weird system, but it's closer. It's not bad.
At least we're on the ground floor, kind of moving up a little.
Yes.
And then also, I showed a clip here in my class of the owner of Shivani Yogurt giving all his employees stock. Now, they don't make the day-to-day decisions. However, some of those men and women are going to make millions when he goes IPO. Is that another example you're talking about? The boss sharing all the wealth, so to speak. Still don't make the decisions, but... And then also companies, more and more profit-sharing checks, come around Christmas time. So there is a couple pockets there that are hitting home with what you're talking about. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. So I am, in addition to doing the Sensible Socialist, I'm also a co-host of a podcast called All Things Co-op. So I work with this group called Democracy at Work. And what we're all about as socialists, as people arguing for socialism, is that what we want are worker co-ops. So is anyone familiar with a worker co-op? All right. So like a worker co-op is just a business that is that's owned and operated by the workers, that they get together in a democratic fashion and they make the decisions that make the business run. They decide what to produce, where to produce, what to do with the profits, and everybody has a decision. And so I see that as basically all that I argue for in socialism. So if you hear about if you take away anything from this lecture, it's this: socialism is democracy at the workplace. That's all that it means. If somebody tells you socialism is about a gulag or it's about the state running things and they just want to make everything the DMV, that person is full of shit. What socialism is just workers owning and controlling the means of production, businesses. So it's just a worker self-directed enterprise. It's just getting rid of that boss at the top who doesn't do anything or and I'm talking about a boss who doesn't do anything, like a boss who's absent and just takes the money, right? Let's get rid of all those people because those people are taken from the rest of us and we can all work it out. I mean, I don't know how many of you have this feeling. I know I've had this feeling a lot where you're thinking, God, if we just got together and made these decisions, this business would run a hell of a lot better. That's the same idea. The same idea is that we just want an economy that is based fundamentally and principally on democracy, equality, and freedom, right? Which is what capitalism supposedly tells you it has. But you're not free, you're not equal, and you have no ability to be a participant in the economy. It's fundamentally alienating and frustrating. So what we want is just a society and an economy that isn't like that. A society and an economy that is based on genuine participation of individuals, honest democracy, and freedom. And I think that if you use those things as the fundamental grounding of your economy instead of competition, greed, avarice, capriciousness, you're going to have an economy that works a lot better for pretty much everybody else. So worker co-ops, man, that's the way to go. And if you're interested in learning more about that, you can check out the podcast, All Things Co-op. It's me and a few other people from Democracy at Work, and we talk about just all things related to co-ops. So different kind of co-ops, different co-op legislation. Right now we're doing a whole series on the Rochdale principles, which are all these like principles of how you can be a really good business when you're owned and operated by your workers. And so that's really what I'm focused on right now, because what I see socialism as is all these worker co-ops working together with a political party that then gets elected into power and makes laws that make it a lot easier to be in a worker co-op and a lot harder to be in a single owner business, and eventually to make it illegal to own your own business. So if we get to the abolition of private property part of it, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about not allowing a person to individually own a business so that they can employ other people. Just like we don't allow somebody to own a farm and buy other people. Because all that you are doing when you're being a worker is renting yourself instead of selling yourself. So that it's not chattel slavery like we had in the South until 1865, but it's wage slavery. And that is one thing that we are all basically dedicated to ending. We are dedicated to ending the buying and selling of human labor anywhere, and that includes renting it as well. So you're not going to be someone's piece of production machinery. You're going to be a human being with the ability to enter into organizations and businesses and enterprises that you can freely engage in, that you won't have to, because the economy will be fundamentally based on providing at least the minimum social need of housing, of food, housing, shelter, education, healthcare, and all those kinds of things. You have a society that takes care of all those bottom things and lets everybody free to do what it is they want to do. And I think that if everybody is free to do what they want to do instead of fearful of losing their job, we're going to all be a hell of a lot happier, more productive, and feel freer and able to participate and feel belonging to a society that genuinely cares about us, which is the opposite of how we feel now. We feel like the society doesn't really give a shit about us, and it's us on our own, and we got to do what we can do. And if we have to step on a few hands and toes to do so, well, that's just the way that it works. And if I have to make a business that fucks over my best friend, but it's part of our business, well, that's just business, because apparently morality doesn't apply to business. All of that is bullshit, and we should get rid of it and set up a new system that's going to be a lot better for everybody else. And that's what socialism argues. It's not arguing for labor camps and denying of freedom and all that kind of stuff. It's quite the opposite. It's arguing for freedom and for democracy, for equality. And so I know that might be different than what we all learn about things like the Soviet Union and North Korea and China. And if you want to talk about that, we can. But socialism is not about unfreedom. It's actually about more freedom. But somebody had their hand up, I thought.
Yeah, can I answer my question while you were talking?
I answered your question? Look at that. See? Telepathy.
Hey, G, I've watched both sides of the spectrum, and for example, our friends to the north in Canada have a different health system. I've also heard some complaints about that. For example, I need ACL surgery. Well, that's not a life-threatening, so you can wait 6 months, 8 months. I mean, are those balance stories about Canadians' health system, or is that just the capitalists stepping in and saying, see, socialism bad, you don't want that? What have you heard about example like that? It's not a life-threatening, surgery, so we can wait longer to do that.
So in systems, to frame that, I think it's important to, you have to compare the Canadian healthcare system to the British healthcare system. So the British healthcare system is called the National Health Service, and it is government run. So the hospitals are government run. The doctors are government employees. There are sort of mandatory things that hospitals have to do that they don't necessarily have to do in the United States or even in Canada. So they have, a stricter system. They have stricter timelines. They have to meet those timelines. There's problems if they don't. And they generally provide at least better healthcare on better timelines than they do in the United States, on average. Ben Shapiro, I don't know if you guys have seen that. He's a super douche, but if he said that America has the best healthcare system in the world if you can afford it, which is true. If you're very rich in the United States, the healthcare system is the most incredible in the world. But if you're of standard income, it's an abysmal system. But let's compare the National Health Service to the Canadian system. The Canadian system is a single payer system, meaning that it's an insurance company. The government is the insurance company, but all the hospitals are still private and can still sort of make decisions on their own. So when it comes to the timetables that you'll see in the Canadian system, that's hospital dependent. Different hospitals make different decisions on time of wait times and different things like that. But they do, understandably, prioritize. Oh, look, you can see my cat there. Prioritize. He's right here. See. But you can see the wait times are dependent on hospital decisions, but they're usually understandable wait times. That yes, if you need an ACL but somebody needs a new heart, they should probably go first. And so there are a lot of reasons for there to be these understandable kinds of wait times and different things. And to be honest with you, if you go to the doctor in the United States, you tend to wait a freaking while. My wife is very, very pregnant, like gonna have birth in like a week or two, and we've had to go to the doctor many times. And boy, do you wait, and boy, do you get jerked around, and then you got to deal with all the health insurance stuff, which is a joke and a ridiculous system in and of itself. So the American healthcare system is amazingly broken. And if you look at the Canadian healthcare system, if your biggest complaint is long wait times, that's a hell of a lot better than going into bankruptcy because you broke your leg, which definitely happens. I've seen that happen working at a bankruptcy law firm. Oh, that's my wife making Indian food for my in-laws who are also coming today. So yeah. So but if we look at something like healthcare, right? I mean, you can have you can have three opinions about this. One, that healthcare is not a right. It shouldn't be something that the government provides for you, and that you're on your own. That it's a laissez-faire, to each their own, figure it out and go fuck yourself system. You can have that opinion. It's a pretty malicious and capricious and terrible opinion, but it's one that people have. The other one is that the government should basically pay private doctors so that you pay one tax and everybody gets covered by health insurance. All right, that's a decent idea. The other one is that the state should provide health care to all people, and that those three systems provide different levels of coverage at different prices. But the system we have in the United States is the highest cost with the worst outcomes, and the one that they have in Britain is the one with the highest outcomes and the lowest cost. So if you look at like one of the best healthcare systems in the world, especially for where it's located, the Cuban healthcare system, it's a state-run system, but it produces incredible results, better results than we have in the United States at a fraction of the price. So at least when you're talking about healthcare, it appears that like the railroads, like usually airlines and different things, that if the government tends to own and control those, that the price gouging tends to be less, the services tend to be higher, and the outcomes tend to be better. So there needs to be accountability, and there needs to be the ability of the people to affect those businesses, which is why in the United States, it'd be a concern of mine that we would nationalize our healthcare system because our government is so unequal and unfair and undemocratic and bought and sold by the elite. And so in this case, I would prefer a single payer system so that we could have privately owned hospitals that would for me hopefully be cooperatized so that the doctors would be able to run the hospital, not a bunch of fucking administrators at the top of the healthcare system sucking all the money out of it, and instead have a bunch of doctors and nurses owning the businesses together so that they could provide low cost, high quality health insurance for everybody, and that the government would just be a way of providing the payment for that service so that you wouldn't have to be point of sale. But fundamentally, if there were co-ops, it could just be point of sale. Because again, I believe in socialism, which is a fundamentally worker cooperative economy in every business. So if that's the case, I'll just pay the doctor because it's probably going to be cheaper, because the doctor isn't looking to price gouge me. You're looking to make $1 million, because that's not the point of the economy. The point of the economy isn't just to make a gobs of money for me because I'm a selfish bastard. It's to make sure that everybody can survive and thrive in the world that we all live in together. So part of this is very pie in the sky and idealistic and sort of like we should just have a better society. And the other one is very practical and very much like the system that we have right now is broken and it fucking kills people. And so we should figure out a way that we don't have that system, because people should not be unnecessarily dying. People should not be having lives that are harder just so that a few people like Jeff Bezos can fund his own space program. That's fundamentally unfair. And I think that, dare I say, most of us agree with that. Most of us feel that way, that there is fundamentally just an unjust and unfair system that we have to participate in every day. And most of the ways to deal with it are just like, well, just do your best and do the best that you can and try to be happy and find a hobby. But for me, that's not good enough. And what we need is a new economy and a new way to organize our lives. And the way that we can do that is on a socialist basis, a way that owners are no more, and that workers own and control their businesses together in a fundamentally democratic and egalitarian way. And I think that's possible because I believe in human beings and other people and the ability for us to work together and get along and make our society and our world a much better place, a place that we want to live in. And frankly, as somebody who's about to have a kid, I'd like that kid to be able to not live in a world that's on fucking fire And I don't know if that's going to be the case. And I don't think that we're going to solve this problem if we continue on the way that we've been going. That we need a fundamental change in our society. And you guys are just coming of age right now in 2020. You're going to have to deal with this climate crisis. And we're not going to fix it by Jeff Bezos deciding that he's going to just like be better. We're going to have to fundamentally change society. And if we're not going to leave a world that is unlivable for most people, we're going to have to make the change. And the question is, what is the change we're going to make? Are we going to do what Andrew Yang talks about and give everybody $1,000 a month? Or are we going to fundamentally rechange the society so that it works for everybody? To me, it seems pretty obvious. I don't want $1,000 a month. I want a better society. I want a society for my kid to live in that he can feel like he's a genuine member of society and not just an atomized piece of, gel that he can be molded into whatever he needs to do. Good Christ, cat. Cat's going crazy. Sorry. So, okay, does anybody have, I could go into a lot of like ridiculous philosophical details about where all of the sort of philosophy of all this started. If you want to do that, just go to the Sensible Socialist. You can find all of that kind of discussion. But I want to hear any questions. But if we got a little time, I'm willing to usually deal with the elephant in the room, which is like, what happened in the Soviet Union, or is China communist? And we can have those discussions. We can talk about Cuba if you want, but I'd rather take questions. Yeah, in the back. Yell.
So what did actually happen in, Russia?
All right. So what happened in Russia? In order to understand what happened, you have to get a little bit of the background in terms of the way that Marxists think. And so the way that Marxists think is that basically there's a sort of way that history goes, and you have to look at the class divisions in society. So who owns and who works in society. And there's been a few different systems. There's been like a sort of ancient primitive communism where we all kind of worked together in hunter-gatherer societies. We were sharing everything. There wasn't really complex civilizations or anything like that. Then we got agriculture civilized. We had a slave economy where a lot of the people who did the work were slaves, and then you had citizens who could, vote and do all those things like in ancient Athens. Then you had feudalism, which is based on widespread agriculture, but done by feudal lords who own the property and who have serfs that are tied to the land who do all the work. That transforms into a system of capitalism, which has employers and employees as that fundamental difference. And then you're going to move on to socialism, which gets rid of that difference, which is the big change in socialism. So you have to go through all of these stages in order to be able to actually get to socialism, because each stage is a progression on the other, and it does things that the other system couldn't do, and it's much better. So like capitalism is a much better system than feudalism. That was like, they call it the Ancien regime in France, what they had the revolution against. But we had the revolution against the United States, against the king, right? Those systems are worse than a democratic republic that's a capitalist economy. Capitalism is better than feudalism. But you have to go through capitalism in order to ever be able to get a big industrial working class where most of the people are working at businesses that are owned by individuals and all that kind of stuff. And so you have to go through a period of capitalist development to be prepared for an economy that could be owned and operated by the workers, because the workers have to be workers. They have to understand the businesses. They have to have a period of time in which the society develops, creates widespread markets, and does all the things that capitalism does really, really well. There are things that capitalism does really well. So, but you have to go through those systems. So what Marx predicted was basically where we're going to see socialism is at the most advanced capitalist societies. So in the United States, in Britain, in Germany, those are the places where you're going to see capitalism. And the last places that capitalism is going to develop are the backwards economies. That's Russia, China, Korea, these places that have basically been, backwaters and not developed. So if you look at the revolutions, there were revolutions that overcame feudalism in 1789 in France, in 1848, and much of the rest of Europe, which basically got rid of feudalism and put in capitalism, and then capitalism developed. Well, that never happened in Russia. Russia stayed a feudal society, and it was a feudal society right up until World War I. And so you had a bunch of people in Russia who were acquainted with socialist ideas that were saying, it's going to be in Germany, it's going to be in France, it's going to be in England. And they're saying, but look at how terrible our situation is. Let's use these revolutionary ideas to say we have to have a revolution to get rid of that system and use it to get rid of the czar. use it to try to pass over an entire stage of development. So they have a revolution, they get rid of the czar, but they implement a new system where the state owns the means of production and employs people. So the state is the bourgeoisie, and you still have a working class. So what they implemented in Russia after the revolution in 1917 was state capitalism. Now, from 1970, then there's a civil war in Russia when the United States. Remember this. I'm sure you guys didn't hear this. The United States invaded Russia after the revolution in 1917. Along with England and Germany and Japan and a number of other countries, we invaded and had bases set up in Russia to fight against the Revolutionary Red Army. Okay, so we were fighting against the White Army, who committed all kinds of crimes, and we can go into that. But the country was invaded and went through a 4-year-long civil war in which millions of its people died and its infrastructure was absolutely destroyed. It comes out of that still having this state capitalist system where the state owns the means of production and employs all the workers. So you haven't done away with this difference between employer and employee. But Lenin dies and Trotsky is beaten by Joseph Stalin. And Joseph Stalin basically looks around and says, God, we've gone through all of this kind of stuff and we still haven't gotten to socialism yet. So what does Joseph Stalin do? He says, fuck that. We got socialism. Now we have socialism in one country. And what for many people, what that meant was that the state just had to seize everything and the state could employ all the people. The state could be the employer. But socialists, genuine socialists and Marxists looked around and went, you haven't fundamentally gotten rid of the employer yet. The state is just the employer. So you haven't gotten rid of capitalism. You've just implemented state capitalism. And that is exactly what happened all the way through in the Soviet Union. They implemented state capitalism but now, understand, right? What happened in Russia was that you had this single greatest economic growth. There it is again. The single greatest economic growth in the 20th century was the Soviet Union. It was a backwater economy in 1917, and by 1959 had launched the first satellite into orbit, and had a standard of living fairly equivalent to the rest of Europe. It had ungodly economic growth. 10% growth over the period of 20 years. Unbelievable. Nobody had ever seen anything like that. So, was it socialist? No. Was it an economic miracle? Yes. Did it come at cost? Of course. Millions of people lost their lives. But millions of people lost their lives in the United States as it developed a capitalist system. Millions of people lost their lives in Britain as it developed a capitalist system. When the capitalist system gets developed, Marx even said this, it comes dripping with blood because it takes a lot of violence, frankly, to overcome the system that existed before and to get to the next system afterwards. So what happened in Russia, what happened in China, what happened in a lot of the places is that you in Cuba and in Vietnam and in Korea, you have the places that are colonial backwaters, which have not developed their own robust system of capitalism, but are feeding capitalism through imperialism, have revolutions that attempt to overcome an entire period of development and end up instituting governments that oversee capitalist development to a certain point. There are people who are arguing that China is doing this self-consciously, that it will eventually implement socialism, that it is building up a capitalist economy to put in socialism at some future date. I don't know when that future date is, and it seems like with what's going on in Hong Kong, the most important thing to the Chinese are maintaining the Chinese Communist Party's hegemony over the system. But the Chinese Communist Party is not looking at getting rid of the difference between employer and employees. It's the employer. So, of course, it has no interest in getting rid of that. And so I don't see there being that much of a difference. And so the closest thing you have to a working socialist economy is probably Cuba. And Cuba is still very much state capitalist. The biggest industries in Cuba are owned by the state. Now, there's a private market in Cuba, and there's been a lot of development of Cuba's cooperative market. But nowhere in the world do you see a system where that is fundamentally based on the democratic ownership of the means of production, the getting rid of the actual employer, and a system based on all of these worker cooperatives getting together and running the system. So if you really want to look at what happened in Russia and China and all of those places, it's essentially the attempt to overcome the capitalist period of development and then realizing you can't and having to oversee it. And what happens when you oversee the capitalist period of development? You oversee bloodshed, violence, war, and political strife. And so what you see in China and Cuba and Korea and a bunch of places are widespread political strife, economic disasters, and violence. So fundamentally, the irony of the sort of how many people have been killed by communism is that it's really how many people have been killed by capitalism. And you add to that World War I, World War II, starvation, famine, and capitalism is a system that has caused billions of deaths. And we shouldn't put up with it any longer. And the way to put up with it longer is to look at the advanced economies like the United States and Britain and France. And now, I mean, China is an advanced economy. So you're looking at these advanced economies now and saying, now we're ripe for socialism. The question is, how are we going to achieve it? Which is a whole question. There's people who think that we can get elected and do it and have a sort of reform our way to socialism. And there are others who think that it has to be revolutionary and that we have to have some kind of revolutionary break with the former era. And I kind of believe in both. I think that there's reform on the way to a revolutionary break. And my hope is that that revolutionary break will not be as violent as previous revolutionary breaks has been. But it's obviously been the case that those who are going to lose in a revolutionary moment tend to, burn the fields rather than letting someone take them. So we'll see about that. But question.
Yes. You're putting capitalism to blame for all the deaths that have happened, but you can also make a point that a lot of the other systems that came before it also caused a lot of people to die.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah. Look, every system has costs. Development comes at the cost, comes at a human cost and an environmental cost, and there's always costs to development. But if you look at capitalism, one of the things that distinguishes capitalism from other regimes is the ability for it to engage in industry, and so doing things on an industrial scale. So the previous system, feudalism, never had a problem with overproduction. The problem was always scarcity. That was the issue. Like everything is scarce. That's why things are expensive, and we have to have these kinds of dynamics. Capitalism does away with that in its industrial production, and its problem is that it overproduces. Right? It produces more than people could buy, and so it overproduces and goes into a crisis. So the one thing that it also overproduces is violence and bloodshed. So you would have never seen World War II in a feudal era because you didn't have the ability to industrially produce bombs, guns, planes, and people. And so capitalism is an industrial system. So it produces, it has all the same consequences of other systems, death, destruction, development, all that kind of stuff, but it does it in an industrial scale. So there are benefits to that. The standard of living that we all have is because of the ability to industrial produce, but the wars, death, violence, economic, and ecological destruction that it causes is also on an industrial scale. So you have this dichotomy, you have this thesis and antithesis, and the way that they relate to each other is the sort of system that we will inherit. And so for me, it's one of those things that how can we find a system that decreases the cost of development, makes more sustainable development, doing those kinds of things that doesn't necessarily come with all of that has the same benefits of industrial production without the same costs. And to me, the big fundamental problem is that there are owners that have a perverse interest in maintaining their own wealth and status and do things that would otherwise be antithetical to human beings. And so we have a system that makes certain human beings do things that is anti-human, and we need to excise that from our entire system. People who are greedy and capricious and nasty should be as weird as people with schizophrenia. You know, I mean, it should be. We should treat it as a mental illness to be how it is to be successful in American capitalism today. I think that the way people think about how they generate money and how they don't think about all the consequences really is a mental disorder. And I think if you look, there's all kinds of studies that show that sociopathology is common amongst the people on Wall Street and the sort of higher echelons of the society, because the society is sociopathic. It is fundamentally anti-human. And so we need to implement a system that's fundamentally human. And that's all that socialism is. It's not anti-human, it's pro-human.
Another thing, when I was listening to what you said, workers own into the business and also did all the work. I have a question on how, like, our government has all these branches trying to communicate and trying to get these things done. But we do that with everything. How are we going to get stuff done compared to how one person has an idea, gets that idea done as soon as possible because they don't really have to argue with 100 people who think this is a good idea.
Yeah. So you do have a system in the United States that's intended to be slow, deliberative, not very quick moving, and frankly, ineffectual and unproductive. And so there are a lot of people who argue that that was a genius of the founding fathers to make the system as deliberative and slow and whatnot as it is. I think it's a flaw, and I think it was done deliberately to stop the movement of, I mean, the only reason that we have a U.S. Senate is to stop the House of Representatives, which actually represents people, because they knew people would not put up with the system that the United States Constitution actually implements for very long if they didn't have a body who would maintain it. So I think when you think about worker production, I mean, I'm right now engaged in starting my own worker cooperative. We're developing a piece of software and we're doing it. I originally had the idea, but I didn't have the technical expertise. Now, I could have said, it's my idea and fuck you, I want all the money, so I'm just going to employ you and I'll pay you, X amount of dollars, but I better get X amount of dollars plus 10%. Otherwise, why am I doing this? I could have had that perspective, but I didn't. I said, you have a skill set I don't have. You have a skill set I don't have. Let's all get together and decide how we're going to do this. And let's be decent to each other and split the money in a way that we agree is fair. Maybe that's equally, maybe it's not equally, but let's have a discussion about that and do that. And it's been a great process. And we've come to a lot of really good decisions that if I had to make those decisions on my own, I may not have made the best decisions. So I fundamentally believe in that democratic principle that the more people who are actually engaged, energized, and educated and want to have an impact on something, if they all get together, the outcome that comes out from that is usually much better. But if you have a system that disincentivizes participation, disincentivizes you from feeling like you have the ability to control and have an effect on and that you should be educated on and all that kind of stuff, then the system is going to be slow and deliberative and grind to a halt and be fraught with divisions and all that kind of stuff. And so when you're thinking about a fundamentally democratic way of running a business or an enterprise, thinking about the United States Congress should be the farthest from your thought. Think about how you organize a group project with your friends. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. Genuine, deliberative democracy oriented towards a specific goal. So it's putting more minds onto something to make it better rather than saying one individual. It's this like monarchist idea that like the king has the idea and has the best way of running society, and all we need is somebody just a king to sit on top of the society and everything will get orderly, and or we just need a dictator to make sure that we're safe and protected from all the evils outside of the gates of the city. We don't need that kind of shit. We need democracy. We've all come to the conclusion that democracy is a better way to run things. Why doesn't that exist in our workplaces? The reason it doesn't exist in our workplaces is that our economic system is fundamentally based on dictatorship and an autocracy and not democracy. So we might have societies who are based on democracy, but where we spend the majority of our lives, 8 hours every single day, are dictatorships. And we shouldn't be living in dictatorships. We've all agreed that democracy is better, so why not at work? Why don't teachers control the school? Why do they need an administration? The teachers know what's going on. The administrators are just sucking money. That is how, fundamentally, this student council should actually be a body that's doing something because the students are participating at the school too. But what's the student body? A thing to be able to put on dances and do other stupid shit? It's dumb. So we could have these institutions of democracy, but we don't use them because we all understand that we don't fundamentally live in a democracy. We live in a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. And so this system, capitalism, is not democratic. It's not based on freedom. It's not based on equality. It's based on subjugation, autocracy, and ultimately exploitation. And that's a system that we should all be enraged by every single day. But we're beaten down by even this education system. What's the point of an education system in capitalism? Is it really to make you smart? Do you really think that the system is making you really intelligent? No, it's making you just smart enough to run a machine when you get out of school, but not smart enough to break it. Chew on that, man. I don't want to be a downer, but Jesus, it's true that you got to think about who's really benefiting from all the things that are going on in society. And a lot of the times it ain't you. Are you really being benefited from the education that you're getting? Could you get a better education somewhere else? Could you get a better education where you are if things were different? The answer is yes. So the responsibility lies on your shoulders. Are you going to do something about it or are you not? And, I mean, I'll be selfish and say the first thing that you could do is vote for Bernie Sanders in the primary if you're 18. Or when he inevitably becomes the Democratic nominee, vote for him for president in November. Because that will get us a long way to ridding ourselves of some of the deepest problems of our system. But is Bernie Sanders a socialist? No, he's not. He's not talking about eliminating owners and disallowing people from owning businesses and increasing worker cooperatives. He's talking about making a Canadian healthcare system and making your tuition, your college education like your high school. So it's a good step in the right direction, but is it socialism? No. Yeah.
I've heard you still bring up the point of like abolishing ownership, but does that also mean like we cannot own our house or I can't own my phone?
No. So there's a difference between what we would call personal property and private property. So your personal property are things that you possess and that you use, right? So a house is essentially a possession. You don't normally make money at your house. Now you can, it's possible to do that, but so your house is not usually seen as capital, something that you can generate additional income with. Now you can do that based on market dynamics, but it's not productive. You're not producing something because you sold your house for more than you bought it for. That's not capital. So your house can be yours. Now, I don't agree with the way that we kind of own houses and stuff right now. I think that there should be no deed to a house, but there should be a possessory right, I would call it. So like you'd be able to go in, say you move to a town because there's an opportunity in a town. You should be able to go to the local housing board and say, hey, I just moved here. I need a house. I got, it's me and my partner and we've got 2 kids and 3 dogs. And the housing department says, all right, there's, 6 houses and there's 3 houses that fit what you would need. Pick one of those 3 houses and you can get the possessory right for as long as you need it. Boom. Now I have a possessory right. I can say, this is my house. I can decide what goes on here to a certain degree. Obviously, that's the way it is now. But I can decide what goes on here. I can say who can come and who can go. But so it's like my wallet or my car or something else that I use on a day-to-day basis. Those things are going to be able to be yours. But if you're talking about a business which employs a bunch of people doing social labor and that is engaged in the exploitation of workers, that's illegal. That would be impossible to have. So that's the kind of private property that we're talking about abolishing. Private productive property that can be that is essentially capital. That nobody would be able to be allowed to own capital because owning capital would be equivalent to owning a slave, and we see that now as something reprehensible. You shouldn't own slaves. I see a sort of post-socialism transition as everyone would be as squeamish about employing someone as they do buying someone today. And I think that we should all feel pretty squeamish about that because renting a human being isn't that much better than buying one, is it?
So I'm going to piggyback off that because one of the biggest concepts in America is like copyrights and protecting ideas and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I want to hear what you have to say about that type of thing.
Yeah, so the quick and short of it is that copyright is bullshit. I don't believe, I'm a content creator, right? So I've written a book, I've produced this podcast and things like that. But copyright is basically another way to make a commodity out of something that isn't otherwise a commodity. And so it's basically a way. Capitalism has this tendency of making everything a commodity, including human beings. And so it is now even gotten into the point where ideas can be commodities that are bought and sold and have a certain price value and all those kinds of things. And that's fundamentally antithetical to progress, that there is this idea that you need a copyright protection because that's what's going to incentivize people to produce works of art and all that kind of thing. But I think that you talk to anybody who's fundamentally creative, whether that be a musician or an artist, something like that, and they're not really producing the art to make a ton of money. Would they like a ton of money for it? Sure. Would they, if they didn't have to work, would they just be musicians? Yeah, probably. But are they really looking to make $1 million? Not really. It's not the sole goal of their artistic enterprise. If the sole goal of your artistic enterprise is to make $1 million, then you make, shitty pop music. You don't make good, decent music that people genuinely want to listen to. So, the way I would say it is that, look, in a socialist economy, copyright would be non-existent because you wouldn't be able to alienate something from something creative. If they want to do something creative with something, then they can do something creative with it. And there's not going to be this notion of theft because, one, the system is fundamentally providing you with everything that you need. So everything else that you're doing is basically for fun. So you're not going to have that kind of competitive, this is mine and fuck you want the credit for it and all that kind of stuff. That it would be a generally more cooperative society. So the idea is like, yeah, use my idea, like riff off the thing that I did. Like, I think that's cool, and you're expanding creativity, and we're working together in a new way to come up with new interesting things. It's quite the opposite of what happens in music nowadays, which is that basically you don't even want to write any music because you know somebody's probably written that melody before, and if you are any bit successful, they come back at you and say, I wrote that and I have the copyright on it, so now you have to make me a co-writer and pay me all your royalties. And so it disincentivizes people from making music because everybody who's a musician is just stealing from everybody else. That's what music is. There's a finite number of notes. It's not like a brush stroke where there's millions. There's 8 notes. There's not much you can do. So copyright is basically the theft of progress, and it needs to be done away with immediately.
We'll have to shut you down, brother.
All right. Well, hey, that was... I hope it was less like philosophical and boring. And I don't know if it was boring for you guys. I know I'm not there in person and whatever, but tried to make it at least a little bit interesting and relevant. Because this is going to be important to you guys' life. This conversation is not going anywhere, and it's only going to get more dire. So pay attention. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sensible Socialist Podcast. This podcast is supported by listeners like you, and no advertisements or anything will ever be said. If you want to support the podcast, please go to patreon.com/sensiblesocialist and give today. Also, please give us a review or a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast, as it greatly helps. All right, see you next time.